Hello everyone, and welcome to the Keller College Environmental Sustainability Talk of Trinity Term. So welcome. Today, Professor David Wallom and Dr. Laurence Wainwright are going to be in conversation, and their subject is getting to net zero, sustainable development, what will it take? Professor Wallom and Dr. Laurence Wainwright will discuss the challenges and possibilities for sustainable clean energy sources and whether a transition to a carbon zero and environmentally sustainability economic model can simultaneously improve the quality of life for the world's least advantaged people. The lens of inquiry for this discussion will be grounded in the sometimes uncomfortable reality that different actors often have multiple and even conflicting interests, and that getting to net zero sustainable development will require concessions and compromises to incentivize change and align agendas. I'd just like to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Laurence Wainwright is Course Director of the MSc in Sustainability, Enterprise and the Environment and Departmental Lecturer. A teaching and learning oriented academic, Laurence has a decade of experience in lecturing, facilitation and supervision across universities in Australia, Sweden, United States and the United Kingdom. Laurence is passionate about the holistic development of the students whom he teaches and helping them to develop into well-rounded individuals with a mindset of intellectual curiosity and courage, continuous self-improvement and service to a mission beyond themselves. Laurence has taught across several subject areas, including regulatory science and public health, sustainability and corporate social responsibility, and management and leadership. Laurence's research at present is focusing on understanding how firms respond to NGO-produced guides, rankings, and lists, which rate their performance on social and environmental issues. Professor David Wallom is Associate Professor and Associate Director, Innovation of the Oxford E-Research Centre, Department of Engineering Science. He's the founding course director for the MSc in Energy Systems and also leads two separate research groups, Energy and Environmental Informatics and Advanced E-Infrastructure and Cloud Computing. He has led Oxford participation in over 80 research projects in areas such as cloud utilisation, cybersecurity, smart energy grids, research data management, green IT, ICT security, and institutional repositories. He's a member of the GCHQ recognised Academic Centre of Excellence in Cybersecurity and the University of Oxford Sustainability Working Group. I'm delighted that you can both be with us this evening and to give us this conversation. And in a second, I shall say over to you, but could I please, first of all, just remind all other participants, please to turn off your cameras and microphones. At the moment, we've got two people showing on the screen together with our esteemed guests, and that's Thorkill and Mike Breakel. If you could both bow out, that would be great. Stay with us, but turn off your mics and your cameras. And I shall say over to you, David and Laurence.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sandy. Yeah, so I think one of the first things to do is maybe sort of set out a little sort of initial position, and maybe Laurence, you'd like to sort of take a few minutes just to sort of give a few comments on so your thoughts in this area.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the college for having us along tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, David. It's really great to be in conversation with you. So look, this is a massive question, and we could probably justify 10 hours speaking about this and not really get to the end of it. I'll start by saying there's a really positive sign. So right now, parallel to this event, there's two other events going on with a similar focus. There's one on food waste being run by the Oxford Sustainable Business and Entrepreneurship Society, and another run by my esteemed colleague, Professor Cameron Hepburn and Inga Anderson, discussing biodiversity. And I think it's a really exciting sign of the times that we have these conversations, and there's so many of them happening now. And I just don't think that this was happening as recently as 2 years ago. And to the participants in the audience today, it's a real privilege to have you here, and we want to sort of invite you to be part of the conversation. So it's not just us talking at you; it's you being a part of this as well. So look, I like to speak in metaphors, and I have this tangled headphone set in front of me, and I remember before wireless headphones, as recently as a few years ago, you'd arrive at the gym and your headphones would be tangled like this, and you'd spend sort of 10 minutes trying to untangle them before you can actually get them in your ears. And what we're dealing with here is a wicked problem. It's a conundrum. It's an interconnected, non-linear problem with multiple actors, multiple and oft conflicting interests and objectives. So, to the ends of the question, I suppose I'll start tonight by saying that I think we have to attack this on multiple fronts. We have to use sort of all of the options available to us. That includes market forces, market mechanisms, and business, and saying, well, for better or for worse, and paradoxically, business has been a big part of getting us in this mess, but it's also part of the way out of it. We have to use regulation. We have to use smart policy. We have to use the consumer and demand end to get people changing their purchasing patterns. We have to have genuine leadership from society, from individuals, from companies. Humans are emotional beings, and they need a good story, a compelling reason to go on a journey. And we need to tell people why this is a journey that we need to go on. So look, I'll stop there and throw to David for your opening remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and yes, thank you very much to Sandy and the college for inviting me to this. So I think from the point of view of the initial question, the transition to zero carbon, of course, there are now huge numbers of activities both within Oxford, within the region, and obviously globally in how we're going to achieve net zero. And many of those things, when you think about them, what we realize very quickly actually is that there's no one single solution. There's no one single best way of doing it. And it struck me actually whilst I was today writing writing for one of my future DPhil students. I had to write for the ATSR for her, and it was like, well, okay, summarize what she's doing, what she's going to be doing, and it was like, well, in many ways, it's about the fact that every single area will have a different solution. And we have to work out actually that what may be best for even as locally as Oxford may not be best for Swindon. Now, obviously, Swindon and Oxford, there is a huge competitiveness between them. But it comes to this thing that actually, reaching net zero is going to require any number of different pathways. Obviously, it's going to require social change, and the degree of social change will, of course, depend on actually how much of a net contributor we are at the moment. It's going to require technological change, and the thing that I find slightly frustrating, of course, is that's not just change to technologies that haven't yet been developed that are going to be essential at scale, for example, CCS and CCUS, but also actually the adoption of technologies we already have that are clean, that actually for various other reasons are not nearly as well adopted as they can be. The other side of this, of course, is we have to recognize some technologies that maybe have been touted as solutions may actually may be stopgaps. They may be paths on the way to a future sort of net zero solution. But we have to realize that they're not the magic bullet themselves. And one of the things always I feel about that are particularly the idea that we can prescribe technologies that are going to be the solution for a particular problem. And I always think EVs on this one. And, everyone says, oh, well, transport will be solved by electric vehicles. And for me, that sounds like us trying to prescribe a solution when actually, there's continual technological development. And from that point of view, we have to understand that what's the solution now may not be the solution in 5 years. It may not be the solution even in 2 years. And we've got to think and change and flex our pathway to make the most appropriate set of changes and choices. And as you said just now, Laurence, the other side of this and the support to all of this is regulatory change. You know, many possible solutions are around at the moment and are actually unfortunately impeded by either out-of-date regulation or regulation that hasn't really thought about how it can impact new adopted technologies and things like that. So from my side, I think it's about making sure that we recognize every place will require a different solution. But at the same time, we should document and make sure that best practice is always captured, because other solutions may come along and be great in another area at another time.
No, look, very well said, David. I thoroughly agree with your sentiments there, and I'm wondering if you might sort of explore one of these themes, this idea of kind of being realistic rather than idealistic about solutions, and looking at the nuances and subtleties, and looking at the grey areas in between, and saying it's not, you know, it's not black and white. These are complex issues. That there's life cycle analyses to be done when we're thinking about energy sources, when we're thinking about electric vehicles. Many people naively think, well, because it's electric, you know, it's somehow going to be green. Well, you know, the energy from that has to come from somewhere. So why don't we sort of dig into this theme of you know, the subtleties and the nuances and the taking a holistic view of the life cycle analysis, whether it be a product, whether it be a source of energy, the materials required to build it, and so on.
Well, if we just think about generation, of course, the UK, you know, the UK has had a number of days recently where, of course, we've been able to utilize almost 100% renewable energy, which is a huge step forward in our path to net zero. But of course, one of the things is that we think about there is actually, well, how are we measuring that? You know, we talk about the measurement of the carbon intensity of the electricity that we use, and that's a figure that's actually produced for us by National Grid in collaboration with a couple of other organisations, including the university here. And we measure that, we look at that, and it's very clear actually that when you take a close look at this, it's a very nuanced view. Because the measurement that's given is the carbon intensity of the electricity that is delivered and consumed by the customer. It's not the carbon intensity of all energy sources that are connected to the grid at the time. Because of course, renewables, although excellent, have the problem of that they are not dispatchable resources. We can't control to any great extent when they do or don't provide energy. They are, of course, subject to the whims of the weather and everything else. And so because we have a requirement for a dependable electricity system, you know, it's often, you know, if you were to be sitting in the middle of Oxford right now and we were to have our energy purely just supported by renewables, there'd be a high likelihood our call could end at any moment. So, of course, we have backup, we have spinning reserve, and in many cases, these are currently, of course, combined cycle gas turbine power stations. But of course, they don't feature in the carbon intensity of the grid calculation or presentation at the moment because they're not actually supplying electricity. So from that point, I feel there's a bit of an information shortfall, that people have a view of what the network may be. They feel the network is like it's their energy is being supplied hugely by renewables, almost to the exclusion of everything else, but they don't see the background. And we've seen this actually elsewhere. So of course, you know, we saw post Fukushima, which I have to say actually, so Fukushima was obviously a devastating accident with a nuclear disaster on top of a natural disaster. Tens of thousands of people were killed by the natural disaster, which was a huge tsunami and earthquake that actually hit, that was 2 orders of magnitude larger than the nuclear plant was designed for. So in some ways, we can't be surprised that there was an incident. But actually, in terms of the fatalities that were caused by the Fukushima accidents, by the accident itself and not the natural disaster, basically, apart from those that were in the plant, no one actually has died from the Fukushima power station itself. You know, from that point of view, actually, you could say, because of course Japan made a reflex action then to close to stop all their nuclear power stations, and actually increase the carbon intensity of their electricity massively, as of course did Germany. Right. So actually, there's high likelihood that that caused more fatalities because of increased air pollution than actually the accident, than the accident did in the first place, even including those that died in the plant itself.
It's such a sharp point you make, David, and I'll say a number of things on this. In my own research around fishing, we see that humans are very emotional rather than logical around these types of things. So I'll give you an example. When there's a dolphin in a trawl net and there's a photo taken of that, there's generally outrage. So if the NGOs come up to a fishing vessel and they get a picture of a dolphin being caught, in some cases that can remove the business's sort of social license to operate, and it can, in many cases, have its sort of legitimacy challenged and revoked. Now, contrast to that, let's say a trawl net pulls up hundreds and hundreds of critically endangered small crabs, crustaceans, and they're killed. Of course, humans value things quite differently, and the crabs, for most people, are not quite as compelling as the dolphins. However, from a biodiversity and ecosystem resilience viewpoint, the crabs are far more critical than the common dolphins, of which, say, there are tens of thousands in the region. And again, we may make a policy based on what looks like a good idea, but it's not necessarily based on what is actually going on, as is the case with nuclear, for instance. And I guess, to take that conversation a bit further, I'd like to explore this theme of kind of polarization and whether it be nuclear, whether it be just about any topic in the environmental and sustainable development debate. I mean, there is a lot of polarization in the world at the moment, and I think it's getting tough with these issues because my frogs are croaking in the background. They're thoroughly agreeing with my point about biodiversity. But yeah, so look, it's tough. I mean, it's kind of, you're either on my side or the other side. You're with us, you're against us. You're either pro or you're against. Again, this idea that we're not looking at the nuances and subtleties and saying, well, look, I might think that nuclear has a role to play, but I'm not completely convinced. And how do we sort of address this issue of our tendency to sort of want to put people in a group and say, well, you're here or you're there? Yeah,
it's a very, it is an incredibly difficult point, because I think maybe in some of the ways we've got to actually tell people what the consequences are if we don't. I think maybe that's one of the ways. I noted, for example, of course, in America, that currently California is asking people to deliberately manage their demand during the hours of 4 p.m. till 9 p.m.
Wow. With
huge, great posters, TV advertisements and everything. And you sort of wonder, it's sort of like, well, actually, is this because they've built, in California, unlike Texas, of course, which had the massive cold spell, blackouts and everything else, California is a fully interconnected network with all the states around it and everything else. And from that point of view, that's a serious concern in terms of a lack of generating capacity that has obviously developed over a number of years from the energy policy of the state. Now, there, of course, we've had issues around networks being not really developed properly, and therefore, some of the issues around fire and things like that. But to me, I think we get to this point of we actually have to think about getting people to understand the consequences if we're not being completely honest with ourselves about some of these solutions. We've seen, of course, and we're just coming out of the pandemic, and we've seen how people talk about, those in society that maybe have some skepticism about vaccines, some well-founded, some completely unfounded. And I occasionally think scientifically, when we think about the way that the people particularly get on with anti-nuclear, that you do get this idea that it is not completely rational in some of the arguments that are used. They're used emotive, it's very emotional. And so I think consequences is one of the ways that we think about that. The other side, of course, is, and we've seen, we talked about the huge increase in scale of renewable systems that are actually being deployed, and one of the things that's really clear from this, of course, is that renewable energy systems have enormously dropped in value, dropped in cost, right? And from that point of view, we have to think about why that's happened. And of course, it's demand, and I think this would be, one of the things that key, so, from your side economically, how have we got into the scenario with the pricing for renewable systems as they are?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and to be perfectly honest, I'm probably not qualified to answer that as not being an economist. But I'll kind of build on the theme around energy and add a new dimension into it. So I think when we think about energy, a lot of us think about the lights that come on or the gas in our kitchens and nothing else. But I'm going to throw up this idea that we're basically using too much stuff. And if you listening in the audience or anything like me, you get these packages that arrive from Amazon, and you sort of tear it open and get a nice little dopamine rush, and you put the thing, whatever it is, on the wall, and you might use it a few times, but then it sort of fades away. And the elephant in the room is that we're using too much stuff, and the energy involved in making these things, whether it be a t-shirt that's sort of part of this fast fashion cycle that we wear a couple of times and then we end up throwing away, or whether it's the latest and greatest electronic gadget that has huge amounts of energy in its production and ends up, in our shelf drawer there. It's a big problem, and it's very easy to say, well, business is making too much stuff and advertisers are telling us to buy things, but ultimately, we still have a level of agency as consumers, and we are using too much stuff. We are overshooting the carrying capacity of the planet considerably. Our environmental footprint in the rich countries is often 3, 4, 5 times what the Earth can actually sustain, and we need to do something about it. I think a massive problem for many of us is that, and I speak to a couple of the people in this call around this idea, that our primary identity is often as a consumer. We see ourselves as people who buy things, and when we get money, we sort of move up to the next layer of consumption, whether that means moving up from buying IKEA furniture to buying at a Beau Concept or a Danish designer firm, whatever the case is. And in a film like Fight Club, Edward Norton's character is kind of pondering on this question of, if I was a line of IKEA furniture, what would I be? And he's making this point that, for many of us, our primary identity is consumerism, and we're so intrinsically attached to that addressing this bigger theme of using too much stuff requires almost like a philosophical, a moral, and breaking free from this identity that we have, and that's a very, very tricky thing to do. So yeah, look, I'll stop there and see if you have any reflections on any of these themes around the consumer and different thoughts around energy and so on.
Well, so I think from the point of view of the consumer, of course, then we have, I think you could truly say we've never had it so good. When we think about the cost of food, when we think about, in some ways, the cost of energy, in relation to the amount that the majority have available, these things are actually incredibly cheap. And in some ways, that's one of the key problems when we actually think about how we want to change people's behavior, because for many people, no matter how much of a sort of percentage price increase you are to put on some of these activities, some of these sort of resources, it's incredibly difficult to get to a price elasticity point where it actually makes a huge amount of difference.
Right.
When I quite often, and I apologize to my mother now for quoting her on this one, but when I talk to my mum about what I do in my research, and I talk about the fact that when I look at tariffs, so I look about how people may be impacted by changing tariffs. So you're quite often told that, well, you should change electricity supplier because you can get it cheaper. So that to me is automatically a psychological thing, that everyone's view on this is obviously it has to be the cheapest way of getting whatever you can. But actually, you know, what you might say is that, well, okay, we need to introduce some new measures. You know, social responsibility, environmental responsibility needs to come into this. And we need to think about a way that if you were to change tariffs, and I, for example, I might be on a fixed price tariff now, and I might be able to, for example, go to a time of use tariff, which tries to introduce some form of social signals to me that I should really reduce my demand at certain points. And then, of course, the ultimate example of this is real-time pricing, where I get pricing signals that are based on the wholesale price of electricity, and that gets passed to me and gets applied through my smart meter, so that there's much more of a real-time view of how much my electricity really costs at that point. But even so, as it sits within society at the moment, it's very tricky to say, depending on how much that pricing signal is really going to affect me. So, you know, when we come back to the question originally behind this, you know, how are we going to think about this for those that are the least advantaged? I think one advantage those people have in many places actually is we are slightly stuck because of our current infrastructure, because of the systems that we've created over the last, well, it's only 100 and a bit years, interestingly enough, since we've had large-scale electricity. You know, from that point of view, actually, you can see in many countries actually that they're developing systems in a better way because they're starting on greenfield sites. We've seen this already, of course, with mobile telephony. You know, we have this huge legacy infrastructure of copper cables that are stretched all around the country. Many countries in the developing world, of course, have leapfrogged us and gone straight to mobile telephony being the default. You know, and many countries, for example, in Africa, where payment processing systems and things like that are based on mobile phones. So there's no reason in many ways in a lot of these countries that they can't in some ways do the same with their energy systems. And we've seen the rollout of things like microgrids and energy islanding as ways that we could actually do better or build better if we were starting from scratch. And so one of our problems, I suppose you'd say, is we expect sort of 4 nines electricity. We get very upset. So I think I'm in a possibly in a slightly different position to you. I live out in a village in the west of Oxfordshire. So power outages are slightly more frequent for us because we're right on the end of the UK's electricity network, and it's not that reliable when you're right out on the branches. But in a town or something like that, reliability is key. But getting that reliability for us is because of this big legacy infrastructure. Getting reliability through something that may be a small microgrid system that's been designed in such a way that it produces exactly what's required may actually be an advantage longer term. And that then comes back to how people view energy. And that's, you know, and I think that's, you mentioned earlier, you know, the important thing about the sort of different ways that people view the availability of services, the availability of energy. And that, for me, is a particular thing.
Look, very, very well said, David. Some hugely articulate points raised there. And, you know, to build on this idea around viewing things, I mean, I want to sort of frame this theme around how we view nature and how we think about ourselves. And, you know, at a basic level, we're a really advanced form of primate. We're a Homo sapiens. And but many of us have sort of come to think that we're in this position where we can sort of be above nature rather than being part of it. You know, in the Lion King, you know, Mufasa explains to Simba that we're all connected in this circle of life, and you know, it's maybe a bit corny to say, but it's really true. I've got the frogs in the vivarium behind me, as I mentioned, beautiful white tree frogs from Australia, and it's a mini ecosystem in there. It's all very finely tuned. There's worms in the soil. There's slaters that run around. There's the frogs themselves. There's the plants. There's the temperature. If you change that around by a little bit, everything changes. You take the worms out, the whole thing collapses. You increase the temperature by 2 degrees, you have serious problems. The frogs' behavior changes, their breeding patterns go out of sync. It's kind of like a sobering reminder to me as to what we're playing at. And we're overshooting the boundaries of the planet. If we look at Rockstrom's planetary boundaries model, for instance, we're pushing up against the planet in a way that, by definition, is not sustainable. We're wiping out species at a rate that is, we are causing a mass extinction. Amphibians are a good sort of canary in the mine shaft. They're a sentinel species. They live both on land and in water, and they're often the first to go when an ecosystem is in trouble. And their rates of extinction, I think, are sort of sending off alarm bells. Well, at least they should be. Now, I'm going to propose that we should start working with nature rather than working against it. And I think this is, for me personally, this is a passion that I really have a lot of connection to. And I believe that my mum in Australia might be listening to this call, or she might be listening to the recording. And I know in the garden up at Elnora, we always, back in the day, you use the pesticides to keep the slugs away from the plants. But now that's been replaced with using the frogs and letting the frogs run wild, and the frogs eat the slugs. Nature has a solution to this. When we try and fight nature, it usually comes back to get us. The slight irony with COVID, of course, is that we're terrified of this noxious species that's spread right around the globe and caused a lot of suffering to others. And if we look in the mirror, we can probably say that we've done the same to other species in a way. So I think we need to think about our relationship with nature, and also start thinking about the solutions that nature has, nature-based solutions. So the peatlands in the UK are currently in a very, very degraded state. If we get them back to how they used to be, the carbon savings there can be about half of all emissions from agriculture within the UK. That's a finding from this new British Ecological Society report from a couple of weeks ago. And I was astounded to see that. Yes, we need to stop eating as much meat and so on, but we can actually have a really quick win here by getting this ecosystem restored to how it once was. So nature is begging out for us to help it. There are many, many ways we can use nature-based solutions to our advantage. So I think, again, my sentiment there is, let's work with nature rather than fight against it.
Well, absolutely, and interestingly, so a friend of mine, actually from the next village along, owns a beef farm, where he very deliberately operates in a maximal farming way, increasing biodiversity, having a small number of cattle. So you're talking about a very large land area, but a small number of cattle, a small number of sheep. He's got guinea fowl, and he plants some arable, uses that land for arable as well. And it goes back to an older style of farming that is much less intensive. And of course, it produces a product that is actually A, superior, and B, being honest, is more expensive. But then we have to think about, well, okay, there's one of the great ones that's been talked about quite a lot around plate expectation. So there's an interesting one. If you put a really big plate in front of someone and ask them to fill, for their dinner, and ask them to put their own dinner on their plate, they naturally put more on a bigger plate, unsurprisingly, than they do on a smaller plate. So from that point of view, actually, one of the great problems is, we have this idea of what we expect to be able to eat. And actually, as someone who spent a lot of the last few months trying to lose weight, what I've realized is actually we really don't need to eat that much at all. It's sort of a great reduction. And from that point of view, if you then start, and Sandy mentioned this earlier actually, about the idea that sort of getting locally produced produce, and actually the idea that you can do that. And I know that Transition Ensham, who are an ecological group based out of Ensham, they in the past actually came up with a catalogue of local producers that you could actually buy, all of the food that you were going to produce or going to require from a local area. And it's a really interesting idea that if we to start thinking about that and start really, really attributing, food miles as they should be, then it becomes actually quite an interesting thing of, well, okay, I maybe won't have the I'm going, the real one. I'm not going to get that avocado. because my avocado plant that's growing downstairs won't be providing any avocados for quite a long time. But thinking about supply chains, and supply chains are a really interesting thing, particularly, and it comes back to that point I made earlier, actually, about the price of renewable energy systems. Now, there's been a number of reasons why renewables have dropped in price enormously through demand, but also, of course, through supply. And in some ways, it's not entirely clear whether or not, some of that has been through, sort of large-scale production and dumping onto the market, so that, you're getting artificially reduced prices. And we've seen, for example, also in the very well publicized report from the Helena Kennedy Institute recently, over the last 3 days or so, actually around some of the other impacts of some of the energy supply chain. So we have to make sure that we fully understand, and we need to understand where our products are coming from, and we need to understand their full system costs. We talk about, we mentioned solar panels, where they come from. Well, most of them come from China, and there's a big issue around that at the moment. But also, of course, cobalt mining from the Congo, all of these sort of rare earth elements, lithium from Chile. And we talk about all of these issues that are key materials that we actually have very limited sources for. Rare earth elements, interesting enough, are not particularly rare. They're rare because they're actually incredibly environmentally damaging to actually refine. And so not many countries really want to do it. So from that point of view, we need to have an understanding of our impacts. And we've seen, for example, with investments from the UK government, with the Faraday Institute, for example, looking at batteries, a key part of this. So batteries are not the panacea for everything. And one of the key problems with batteries, and I have, I do model radio controlled aircraft. They've all become electric over the last few years. They used to be little tiny internal combustion engines. They're all electric motors now. But one of the key problems they all run on what are known as lithium polymer batteries. They're incredibly energy dense. You can fit them in an aircraft. They go fantastically. But if there's an issue with when they're charging in your home, they generally catch fire and or explode.
Wow.
And so from that point of view, you have to store these things in a fireproof bag in your house. And there's a really interesting, that's a really interesting problem when it comes to actually long-term behavior of batteries. As batteries age, we've seen this with old batteries. You see this with the old the old cells, that they start leaking when they get old. Well, the polymer cell equivalent of that is the cell expands. It quite often can split. Then the chemicals mix, and and you end up with a scenario where you can have a fire and things like that. But this idea that we need to think about the full chain. So what happens when your EV, when the battery in your EV, which is fully integrated into the chassis of your car, when the charging cycle, you've exceeded the number of charging cycles, and your EV battery performance degrades to such a point that your car becomes really not that usable. Yeah.
I'm so on board with this idea of looking at the full value chain of things. And I think we see the tip of the iceberg, which is a huge problem. The meat example you gave is excellent. And, I think we get the Tesco delivery, we get the neat little packaged piece of meat and we eat it and we throw the packet away, and that's the end of our relationship with it. We don't see, and in many cases, we don't even care how the animal was raised, what its life is like, how it was killed, how it was transported, what the energy costs were involved in getting it from Brazil or Australia or the land from New Zealand, out of sight, out of mind. And that's a massive problem. I think we need to start taking a more active interest in where our food and where our stuff comes from. And when we find that we're implicated in a value chain we don't want to be a part of, we have an active choice to walk away from that. So actually, I don't want to be a part of this game. I don't want to be part of a sector that's causing great suffering to people in Bangladesh who are being paid 50 cents an hour, and the dyes are running down the rivers and killing off all the fish. Or I don't want to be part of this factory-fed chicken, which is grown up in 30 days, pumped full of chemicals and killed and having a pretty miserable life. So you do have a choice, and it's cliche to say, but every small decision that one makes does matter. You know, I'm a fisherman myself, a fisher, and I love to go fishing, and I often eat the fish that I catch. And for me, that's a very sort of humbling thing to get me back into the food chain. And occasionally, you get people walking past and saying, "Well, that's very cruel. You're killing an animal." Well, I say, "Well, the fish and chips you got, you know, last Friday night, you know, where do you think that came from? It came from a, you know, from pollock in the, you know, in one of the oceans nearby, and it was caught, it was killed." And so I think connecting to the food chain and the value chain of the stuff that we use is so critically important. In these last couple of minutes before we say throw open to questions, I'm wondering if we can just think about this theme of how do we simultaneously get to net zero sustainable development in a way that's going to raise the quality of life for the world's least advantaged. And I think this is a tough one because, you know, it's very easy for us, you know, in the rich countries to say, well, you know, you need to start doing this or stop doing that. Or if you in these lesser developed countries have the same standard of living that we have in the West, and you have 3 cars and you have a big house and you buy all this stuff, that is going to push the planet to the absolute brink and it's going to knock it out. You can't do that. There's a massive philosophical dimension to this, a moral dimension saying, well, what right do we have to tell others that they can't reach a certain level of development? You know, I've spent a bit of time in rural India, and you know, to go there and tell someone that they can't use, you know, they can't cook things on a fire because it's releasing smoke into the air. I mean, that's a tough one because, you know, to those people, you know, being able to have food takes priority over the, you know, warming of the planet and so forth. So it's a tough one. I mean, maybe it's a boring metaphor, but I think the rising tide metaphor is a fairly good one. I think we can lift everyone up. And I also think, to your point before, David, that we, you know, as you say, we don't have to go through the same mistakes that we in the rich countries made. We can skip a few levels and go straight to green, clean solutions and get things in a better position. But what do you think about this dimension of the question?
So, well, I think actually what we've got to do is we have to fully engage the countries themselves and the institutions in those countries to actually assist, so that some of this, because the solutions may often, it comes back to my first point about these different pathways, the solution may be really specific to that country. And by engaging with the institutions, be that research institutions, be that government, be that non-governmental institutions of that country, they will understand the nuances that are particularly required. I think, you know, so there was been a historic research program actually funded through DFID, the Newton Fund, where there has been long-term collaboration between the UK and other research institutions of other countries, particularly places like China and India and Southern Africa and South America. And actually, by working with these programs, maybe some of those countries, maybe one of those countries possibly doesn't need the Newton Fund support these days, but the others definitely do. But what they actually do is they build bridges that are starting points for long-term collaboration. You know, we've established links with research organizations in countries that have been going on now for, I think the longest one of these is about 10 years that we've been working with an organization in India. And from that point of view, you know, that collaboration means that intellectual property is created equally.
Right.
It's created here and it is created there, and because it is a collaboration, that IP is shared. Its ownership starts out in these countries, and they can exploit it. You know, I think one of the great problems, there's various, you know, sort of calls. Oh well, you know, we should relax patent law for, you know, this area, or what we should do is actually we should work with them in an equal footing relationship, to make sure, because they do have the local specific knowledge, they do bring unique views on problems that, you know, we do have that danger of turning up and going, oh well, you should do this.
Exactly.
And you know, it's those, and you hear stories of solutions. And so Henry Ford, so there was a really interesting one here. So the Ford Motor Company went to build a rubber plantation in Central America. To build a rubber factory. This was before synthetic rubber really came out. And so they shipped a load of factory equipment from America down to Central America. They installed it, and the place lasted for about a year and a half before basically it broke. The equipment wasn't suitable. They realized actually that this was just the wrong thing in the wrong place, trying to create a solution that was focused for them that would never work where it was established. And I think that sort of thing is important. You know, we try and export solutions. We don't export the idea by working with people to tune that solution so it automatically arrives in a country specific manner.
It's an absolutely brilliant comment, and that there's so many positive things about that, and there are so many win-wins. When you get people on the ground who understand the issue better and are able to just to tailor the solution to what is going on in the local context, as you said at the start. So, Sandy, I'm wondering if we might open up to questions now. I feel like we obviously haven't reached a conclusion. We haven't answered the question, but we could probably spend, as I said at the start, another 5 hours going around here and not get to a conclusion. But hopefully you listening today have been able to pick up a couple of things that may have given you a new way of thinking about the problem, or thinking about your own life and the way that you interact with these issues and so forth. So yeah, we very much welcome any questions.
Well, I'm happy to open to the floor. Please put up your electronic hand to ask a question. And I will kick off and show my ignorance by asking you to tell me what are microgrids and energy islands.
So a microgrid is essentially a small piece of electricity network that may be about the size, sort of say a village that has some electricity generation, some electricity storage, and of course the consumption of the occupants of the village. And the electricity network is solely contained within that village.
Okay.
So the idea, and that's an energy island on its own, if it is then not connected to a national scale electricity network, or even an other piece of electricity network. And one of the things that you can see with some of the sort of third world countries, particularly in developing Africa, is actually that the large scale network infrastructure doesn't exist, but there's a will from the occupants of more rural areas to actually support the construction of these electricity microgrids within their villages, within their towns, and at a scale that allows them to support key things. The importance, for example, of electric light, the availability of electricity for light, rather than any sort of burnt torch or oil lamp or similar. A huge reduction in particulate pollution, for example, in people's houses. So you can see health benefits immediately, and that's a low voltage microgrid, just running off small scale PV and LED lighting.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, we have a question, but it's unfortunately it's showing where the number is. Is that Brandon Boccola?
Yes, there's a question from Brandon and also from Selena. I think Brandon was first, and then we'll go to Selena.
Then Selena.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone, and hello from Australia. So thank you so much for the talk so far. It's been really insightful. I'd love to hear a bit more about your thoughts on, so you've spoken about how sometimes there can be a regulatory misalignment between, what is appeasing and what is impactful. But obviously, so on this long road to net zero, do you think that governments plugging the shortfalls that make some of these like energy assets economically viable in the existing markets is actually a sustainable approach? Because, so for context, in Australia, there's a growing need for, load shifting assets like pumped hydro. However, these are in the current markets that have $100+ million shortfalls that can sometimes prevent these projects getting off the ground at all. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how you reconcile the need for these assets immediately with the fact that these can sometimes be banned, that these funding packages from governments can be a bit of a band-aid on perhaps a bigger issue.
Brilliant. Brilliant question. I was gonna throw to David's to begin with. I can explore the theme of governments and policies. And a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to give a comment on the Chancellor's budget and some of the green policies there. And I spoke about the necessity for governments to do things that are obviously in the interest of being re-elected. And window dressing is very, very real, and governments do it, and they do it in a way that to the untrained eye can look incredibly clever and effective. And, I'm from Australia originally, and I'm aware that our country doesn't have a very strong track record on many environmental fronts. We have the worst species extinction rate in the world. Successive governments, well, many governments have actively denied that climate change had any human connection, and others have addressed the problem with very simplistic solutions, whether it be using gas or similar. But to the broader theme, I think we need to be making we need to have science-based solutions. We need to be making, we need to be using real evidence when designing policy, and as much as possible, removing ideology from it, and, throwing to the experts. The government needs to say, well, I'm not an expert on this, I'm a politician, but let's throw this to the, to the Cameron Hepburns of the world and let them tell us what we should be doing. I mean, on the precise mechanisms that you're referring to in the workings of markets and so on. I mean, again, I'm not an economist, but I can talk mostly about the role of business and business contributing and so on. But perhaps, David, you want to jump in at this point with any thoughts?
So I suppose I would say that one of the key sort of drivers that you would expect from government intervention, of course, is to support technology that might be at an early stage of its long-term evolution. So in some ways, what I would hope is that governments do that, but governments do it in a way and with an understanding that it shouldn't be a forever support. It actually has to be tapering towards some point where these technologies can wash their own face. That they can actually support themselves at some point in the future. And therefore, I would say for the particular technologies that you talk about, it's, yes, they can get government support, but it has to be constructed in such a way that at some point in the future, that support will go away. It can't be and this to me in some ways is one of the issues. For example, UK large scale nuclear is a point on this one. It's effectively received eternal government support, when actually what they should have done is said, right, because they had technology solutions actually that were homegrown rather than bringing in external technologies, because they wanted to build very large nuclear power stations. So what they should have done is said, right, well, we will support over a timescale like this until such point as then you will basically then receive real market rate for electricity. And of course, what that does is drives innovation. As soon as governments come in with support that is effectively seen as eternal, they're picking winners. Yeah. And that basically, that bakes in a solution that may not be optimal, and certainly isn't going to be optimal over the lifespan of large-scale energy infrastructure. If we think about the pumped hydro in the UK, this was built in the 80s and still going strong, Dinorwick and places like this. So from that point of view, energy infrastructure, and this is an interesting problem actually with current renewables. When you go and see a piece of energy network infrastructure, a transformer or something like that, it can be up to 50 years old. Actually, one of the major problems with renewables, be that solar or wind at the moment, is their lifespan is incredibly short in comparison. So we're generating all this waste. But more importantly, we've been sort of pushing for a solution because of things like very, very high fixed feed-in tariffs that have baked a solution in a particular direction. Yes, we've seen efficiency gains, and just now we're starting to see that actually these technologies can wash their own face. But it's not clear, of course, and I mentioned, of course, government support from other governments for, sort of for cheapening production to a stage where they can dominate a market. And from that point of view, that's what we have to be careful of in using our government support effectively to pay for their government support, which is an issue.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Over now to Selina for her question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I was wondering a little bit if I could hear your perspective on. I mean, we talked a lot about Africa and the possibilities you have there to establish more sustainable energy grids, like right from the start. I was wondering how urbanization in developing countries play in there. Is that something favorable in the sense that you would have less? You would need less coverage land-wise, or is that something unfavorable because at the same time big cities are known for being very pollutive and having extremely high energy consumption as well?
Laurence, do you want to kick off on this one?
Sure. Thanks for a great question, Selina. It's a really important one, and I'm glad you sort of grounded it in a specific continent rather than just talking generally. It's very useful for us. Look, I'll let David talk about the specifics of energy within cities, but I'll speak very generally about the challenges of increasing urbanization, particularly on the African continent. I mean, there are many challenges associated with having very large numbers of people in fairly small places. Several countries in Africa are expected to see their populations boom in the next 20 or so years, and there are going to be a plethora of challenges associated with this. I mean, if we look at a framework like, say the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we're looking at all these dimensions of sustainability, life quality and so on, when we're thinking about energy in cities, we have to not only be thinking about, the sustainability aspects and the pressures that this is going to put on climate, but we have to be thinking about people, about their health. I mean, David alluded to before this idea that particle emissions, kill a massive amount of people every year. I think in the UK it was something like 60,000 people died every year directly from particle emissions. I mean, we don't seem to do very much about that, and we could fix it quite quickly by getting to cleaner energy. But I'm not familiar with the specifics of the continent. I can say that my colleagues in the Oxford Smith School, particularly someone like Robert Hope, has done a phenomenal amount of work there, and there are some really good things happening. There's good things happening in terms of the solutions that David spoke about, in terms of evidence-based policies that are implemented with local expertise. So I'll throw to David at this point around perhaps Selina's question in terms of the challenges of energy and so forth.
Okay, so in terms of the development of the energy networks themselves, I'd say you highlighted a colleague. I'd highlight a colleague of mine in Malcolm McCulloch, who's doing an enormous amount of work looking at energy within Africa. But a particular issue actually is, and one of the things that I look at actually in my own research is the impact of future climate scenarios, particularly on things like future extreme events. And we see there that, of course, that even if we get to the Paris Agreement, fulfill the Paris Agreement with limiting global mean temperature rise to between 1.5 and 2 degrees, hopefully nearer the 1.5, that we're still going to see an increase in extreme weather events, and particularly extreme temperature events. And of course, that leads us to issues around the need for cooling, and actually the energy demand for cooling, and particularly in African cities, of course, this is a key challenge, mostly because we see these cities, and I was quite surprised when I went to Nairobi, and then I've been to South Africa, and I've been to Botswana, and you see these cities, and I'm quite surprised at sort of the designs of some of the buildings there that look incredibly Western, in terms of big glass windows in office blocks and things like that. And you look at this and you think, well, actually, these are not designed for reducing demand. And actually, there are a lot of passive demand reduction methods in building design that can be used to actually reduce the amount of electricity they're consuming in the first place and reduce that need for cooling. because, you know, that could be, you know, over the next 20 to 30 years, cooling within these cities is going to be the biggest problem. But, you know, these are going to be places that really don't have the capacity for large scale continual utilization of air conditioning and things like that. So we've got to work out how we build passive measures into these types of infrastructures as much as possible. The other side of this, of course, is in terms of actual energy generation. You know, Africa is very, you know, of course, is a place that is quite suited to things like solar PV and things like that. But of course, one issue with solar PV in warmer climates is the efficiency drops off quite dramatically. So you actually see that, for example, you know, you get a sort of, you get a dropping off of energy efficiency from the generation that can counter to the point where you have to hugely increase the amount of solar PV that you actually install to get the same amount out that you would get from a much smaller installation in a colder climate. So there are interesting challenges in these areas where you're thinking about actually, you know, how do we generate the energy that we need in these areas in a way that is sustainable? But also then, how do we reduce demand at the same time by building, and hopefully actually, if we were to look in many of these places, using local knowledge about how they build their infrastructure.
Thank you. Those were very interesting points.
Okay.
Thank you for that fascinating question that led to some really interesting answers, Selina. Does anyone else have any questions? I'd like to ask one final question in that case. It's about peat bogs. I was interested to hear you say that there are plans for their regeneration. Do peat bogs not take hundreds or even thousands of years to develop? And is this a long-term process that you're talking about?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. I mean, I've got some notes in front of me here, and I will read off the notes because I want to make sure that I give a precise answer here. It says healthy peatlands play an important role in storing carbon 3 times as much as forests. However, peatlands damaged by draining, planting with trees, or farming start to leak carbon, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Only a fifth of the UK's 2.6 million hectares of peat are in good condition. Estimates suggest that habitat, which ranges from upland moors to rich agricultural lowland, could give off as much as 23 million tonnes of carbon emissions. And the idea is that restoration of these will offer both immediate and also longer term benefits. So it's a 2 timescale component, but it does point to, again, this theme that we should be working with nature rather than fighting against it. So David, do you have any expertise on peatlands?
Not on peatlands, but so one of a piece of research that I did a few years ago, actually, with Oregon State University, was looking at northwestern United States forests. And there's an interesting challenge because of climate change. So these forests, and these are pine forests of multiple different types of pine, but they have a natural pest, the Northwest Pacific pine bark beetle. And this little beetle, it burrows into the wood, and as it does so, it brings a fungus with it, and it dyes the wood blue. Internally, so you end up with pine trees that, when they're cut down, are blue. Now, there's a really interesting issue here. Blue wood can sometimes be more valuable than white wood, but sometimes it can be worth a lot less. So you can end up, and these are commercially managed forests, but you can end up with million dollar stands of forest that actually are hugely economically damaged because they've had pine bark beetle attacks. And the pine bark beetle, because of climate change, so the pine bark beetle is supposed to have a fairly short life cycle. But because of climate change, actually, they're finding the populations are exploding in Oregon State and places like this. And so they're getting huge amounts. And what should happen is the beetle dies at the end of the year, like most insects. Most insects are supposed to die off at the end of a particular calendar year. and then the new population starts. But the populations are starting to drag over. And so they're having huge issues with pine bark beetle infestations causing economic damage, which ends up where you're getting people that are commercial lumberjacks, timber mills and things like that that are closing down. But also, incredibly important, you know, US forests stored 58.7 billion metric tons of carbon in 2019. One of the reasons behind this actually is that these forests are being commercially managed, and they're being commercially managed and growing because they're economically important. If they start reducing because they become less economically important, they're storing less carbon. And from that point of view, that is a huge issue. So wherever we are working with nature, actually what we often see is these are carbon sinks. Where we end up working against nature, we end up almost certainly releasing carbon and causing ourselves, you know, we get ourselves into a feedback cycle where actually we're causing greater and greater issues.
We'll draw a line there and end the conversation, but I'd like to thank you both, Laurence Wainwright and David Wallom, for being such great guests of Kellogg and giving us such interesting and illuminating information, and I hope inspiring us all to work with nature, think about not just the product and the consumption, but the process, both ends, and to consider what can be done towards sustainable energy, particularly for those most in need, not just those who want, but those who need and may not have the advantages that we have. So thank you very much indeed for being with us, and thank you to our questioners for producing such fruitful questions. And I'll say goodbye to you all.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Thank you, Laurence. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Sandy. The pleasure was all mine, and thank you very much to the participants for being part of the conversation. And I hope you'll take something away from it. So,
Sure they will. Bye, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.